So today we're going to talk about porn, but first I want to hear a little bit more about your background, what you're into right now, what you're doing right now, and I also like to ask people like if they have a fun party trick.
I love that. Okay. Well, yeah, you covered it. I'm Selena. I'm a queer relationship therapist and sexologist. I'm currently studying my master's to also become a psychosexual therapist. I'm based in Wollongong, Sydney, Australia, which is traditionally known as Darwell Land. Um, my background, I love in all its forms. I think it's incredibly healing and connecting and empowering, and that drives a lot of my work and my philosophy to therapy and to life, really. I love normalizing conversations around pleasure and supporting individuals, relationships to increase the capacity for pleasure, whether that's through communication skills or working through anxiousness or simply just the struggles of being a human in
Yeah.
2022.
Yeah.
um, my go-to party trick, I think that would be juggling.
Oh
um,
wow.
yeah, through I think like through each of our lockdowns, I took it up to keep busy, and I'm still not super consistent with it, still not super great, but it's nice to whip it out every now and then, and
Yeah.
it impresses a few people.
What do you like to juggle?
I just have a juggling ball set at the moment. I haven't leveled up to anything else, but I will get there eventually.
That's a very unique hobby. So
Yeah.
very cool. Okay, so what is your opinion about porn and how does it impact our sex lives?
Oh my God. Yeah. Okay. Um, where do I start? So porn gives us a shortcut to all the feel good hormones that we normally have to work very hard for with our partners. It stimulates our reward systems and our brain's pleasure centers, like so intensely with a huge dose of our desire for intimacy and connection and feeling aroused, all condensed in a 5-minute video.
Mm.
So the sheer intensity of it is, I think, why there's also been a number of comparisons of like porn to drug addiction in the brain, because we do keep going back to it. And the unnaturally strong doses of reward that it creates
Mhm.
also creates unnaturally strong degrees of habituation and desensitization. So it also just continues to escalate
Mhm.
in terms of how it impacts our sex lives. So research also shows that our brains experience greater arousal to novel or new sexual visuals versus more familiar content.
Mhm.
And like this reason alone is kind of starts to make it really clear why folks, especially penis owners, can experience arousal or orgasm difficulties. So it's no wonder that in our fast-paced society that we're 10 minutes into sex and we're getting bored or distracted, because when we watch porn and we start to lose arousal or interest, we can just fast forward or we can click to another video,
Oh,
and we can't
yeah.
do that in real life.
That's so
Um,
true.
yeah, so our brains get lazy at building and responding to organic arousal.
Mhm.
Um, my go-to stats in therapy is that porn is also associated with orgasm difficulties, but also lower libido, decreased enjoyment of partnered sex and sexual intimacy,
Mhm.
and even less sexual and relationship satisfaction.
Mhm.
And this is huge because porn is so accessible, it's so anonymous, and it has endless variety, which
Mhm.
is kind of the exact opposite of partnered sex, which is
Oh,
vulnerable
yeah.
and can feel like a lot of work. And let's be real, can become monotonous at times. So we opt for porn because it's comfortable or because it's easy and the effortless option.
Mhm.
And as a result, our sex lives can suffer.
Mhm. Mhm. I read this study and I wish I could find it exactly and maybe I will and link it somewhere, but it
Yeah.
was something about like Gen Zers or like millennial penis owners having more ED as they get older. And they think it's because of the digital aspect that they grew up with. And they grew up with so much porn at their fingertips.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the stats are like it's jumped within the last 10 years, that since porn streaming sites have been introduced, it's jumped to about like 30 or 35% of like that psychological erectile dysfunction versus the more age-related kind of stuff. And which is a huge jump for like young penis owners, which I think before porn streaming sites were only about like 5%
Wow.
experiencing erectile
That's
dysfunction.
huge.
Yeah.
Wow. You think about like porno mags, you know, it's just a
Yeah.
completely different experience. Like you can't fast forward, like you're saying. When you said that, that really clicked for me because as people consuming content so fast paced, we don't have, some people don't even want to watch the foreplay aspects of some pornos. Not all porn has a foreplay, but some of them do. And most of us will skip through it. I mean, I'm generalizing, but that is so true. That is so true.
Yeah. And I think it's a similar aspect with like how we consume social media or TV or movies as well. You know, we're just like very mindlessly consuming and also not really paying attention. You know, often we're like on our phones while we're watching a movie. And while we're watching porn, it's just we're kind of tuning out as well, or tuning out of our minds.
Yeah, that's so true. So we talked about a lot of cons. Are there any pros to porn?
I think there is so much potential and value in porn as an explorative and sensual aid. You know, like I do recommend it as a form of research for clients who don't know what they enjoy or have no idea where to start. And I think especially the new and up and coming forms of like ethical porn that are coming out, like audio erotica or apps like Dipsy and Quinn. They are like changing the game for pleasure, and especially for female pleasure as well. So they're creating space for imagination and fantasy and bringing back that organic arousal that visual porn kind of takes away from us. But through looking at porn through the lens of curiosity and excitement, or as a means of connecting with your partner, can be so great as long as you're consuming mindfully. You know, so it's an important opportunity to learn more about your own preferences, your partner's preferences, and that can actually improve sexual performance and your sexual experience as well.
Yeah, and when you say that, we're not taught mindfulness from a young age. So when people explore porn, there is no way that they're exploring it mindfully to begin with.
Yeah.
And because we don't explore anything mindfully until we realize how to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Yeah. So queerness in porn. I have some questions that go beyond this for you, but what are your general thoughts and feelings about it?
Oh my God. So many thoughts, so many feelings. I think the first one that always comes to mind for me is that queer sex has become so fetishized or objectified or like so stereotyped, you know, and I think because of our collectively poor sex education as well, we're all flying blind and having to rely on porn to educate us. And I think that's also like kind of a unspoken consequence of historic institutional systemic discrimination as well. But yeah, porn has, I think, created this very narrow view of what queer sex looks like and how it should go. You know, for example, women having sex with women is all about scissoring. And there's a huge objectification element in porn, you know, so especially with like trans folks, you know, they're used as novelties and it's incredibly invalidating. And it can be difficult to kind of separate the male gaze in porn from the way you view yourself or the way that you view your partners. And I think because we also have a learned association of masculinity with dominance and femininity with submissiveness. You know, it can be confronting or confusing for anyone under the queer flag to step into any of those roles because it can feel like you're committing to a specific gender role or expectation that may not necessarily align with what you identify with in your day-to-day life. So I think there's a lot of internal work and unpacking that we all kind of have to do to feel comfortable and aligned with our normal self and sexual self.
Right. So I know a lot of cis women who identify as straight, who
Mm,
watch a lot of lesbian porn.
yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is probably the porn that they mostly watch. I mean, I'm definitely generalizing, but in my experience with
Yeah.
all the cis females I know in my life, that is their go-to.
Mm.
Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. And I think it comes back to like the male gaze that, that refers to just like the over sexualization and objectification of women. It views women through the lens of what they can do for men. Um, and I think because it views women through this beautiful lens of they're having this beautiful moment together.
Mhm.
And I think I lost my train of thought a little bit.
Mhm. I
um,
personally thought like, oh, well, this interest might connotate the spectrum that is sexuality, and
mm,
that we're not so black and white. Like you identify as a straight person, but you find female pleasure very enticing. But I guess that is like what kind of female pleasure you are experiencing and you are visually digesting.
yeah, yeah. Well, because when you think about um, porn that has women having sex with women at the core of it, it's focused on female pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with traditional heterosexual porn, it's generally focused on the man,
Mm-hmm.
and the pleasure and having an orgasm, and um, it's very exclusive of the female's pleasure. Um, so I think that's a big element of women leaning more towards queer sex.
Yeah. And I was thinking about how you said when when people are growing and they turn to porn for like their sex education. I
Mhm.
mean, it is their sex education, because the sex education typically in school doesn't talk about
Yeah,
individuals interacting with other individuals. It talks about anatomy, STDs, and that's about it.
yeah, yeah,
It doesn't talk about any of, and then puberty, but like for the most part, it's not about interacting with someone else or the bad things that happen if you interact with someone else. So, and most people know that's just not the case. I mean, that's not true for depending on where you learn it from, but yeah, I mean, I remember, I think the first porn I was ever exposed to was a fetish porn that was a two girls, one cup. I don't know if that was a thing in
yeah.
Australia, but it was like, and I think I was like 12 when someone sent it to me, and I just couldn't even understand it. Like my brain just couldn't even understand it. Um, and then that was my lead into porn.
Yeah,
So I was 11 or 12.
yeah, yeah. And like I think receiving that kind of intense messaging when you're so young has like such a lasting impact as well. And I think the lack of inclusive or accurate pleasure-centered sex education, and I think it generally means that two questions come up in our minds, and it's like, why don't I look like that?
Mhm.
Or why doesn't my partner look like that?
Right. Right.
um, and the former obviously goes inwards, and it negatively impacts self-esteem and self-image.
Yeah.
And a common stat I also give is that like labiaplasty, which
Yeah.
is like labia removal surgery, has increased, I think, 5 times in the
Wow.
last 10 years since porn has been introduced, like online porn has been introduced.
Yeah.
And the latter question, why doesn't my partner look like that? Um, Obviously pushes it onto our partners, so it's like it's their fault I'm not turned on. It's their responsibility to get me going.
Mhm.
And I think both questions become a sort of breeding ground for performance anxiety and resentment and relationship issues down the track as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And you think about how deep rooted that is. Like we can tell ourselves that we know every vulva looks different, like a face, and we
yeah,
can tell ourselves that there's just a dynamic way to have sex that doesn't look like just the way porn is.
mm,
However, because it's like exposed to us so deep and for so long, we can tell ourselves that, but we can still feel insecurities when interacting sexually. And it is such a shame that like porn has had such a power to negatively affect self-esteem in that way. And even for people who don't regularly watch porn, even for people who've seen 5 little clips of porn their entire life, are like, oh, I don't look like that, so I'm not desirable. Or with someone that's like, well, you don't look like that, so I I don't think, I'm not attracted to this. Um, it is really such a shame. Do you think it's changing at all?
I think so slowly. Like I had mentioned, like the more alternative, ethical porn that has been popping up, and different variations of porn, So I think we are becoming a bit more aware of the cons of porn, the unrealistic nature, the performative aspects of it. And I think even just seeing it in my therapy room, a lot of my clients are already coming to me already aware of the impacts of porn,
Mm,
how it's negatively impacted their lives. And I'm having that conversation even just in my day-to-day life,
mhm,
where it's becoming a lot more common knowledge. And I think in our younger generations as well, um, that porn or traditional visual porn, online porn just isn't cutting it.
mhm,
Um, and I think, yeah, we're also turning to a lot more ethical elements as well in
mhm.
just like our general life, being more ethical when it comes to sustainability or our morals and things like that.
Yeah,
And I think porn is slowly being included in that as well.
yeah. Do you think that porn, because I try to tie everything that we experience sexually to communication. And do you think that there's any link between developing communication skills and
Mm,
porn, or what we
mm.
learn from porn in terms of communication?
Yeah, yeah. That's such a good question. Um, I think, of course,
Yeah,
really.
right.
I think we all know that traditional porn really fails us by not modeling good, healthy communication in the sexual space. Um, and I keep coming back to this idea of like the sexual scripts that porn gives us, because that's an important factor in how we learn to do things, which is by watching other people do things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's so much space for porn to introduce, consent conversations and to model how we can make asking for consent feel sexy,
Yeah.
less so the strict, explicitly asking or getting a contract going,
Mm-hmm.
but more so being able to say to your partner, I'd love to do XYZ, can I do that? How badly do you want me to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so not only, I guess, does it normalize checking in with your partner, caring about their experience, it
Mm-hmm.
also teaches you that you're allowed to ask for what you want during sex,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives you the vocabulary to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big gap in traditional porn.
Right. So, what are some like mindful ways, thinking about this, to interact with porn if someone is choosing to do so? Like, let's say someone is watching this and they're like, oh, but I enjoy porn, but now I'm questioning it. How can they interact with it in a healthy way?
Hmm. I think just at first questioning yourself, your motivations for porn, reflecting on how has it affected the way that you view bodies or the way you view yourself or the way that you view sex. How has it impacted your expectations of how sex should be? Um, Being quite conscious around what are you choosing or what are you avoiding each time that you opt for porn?
Mm-hmm.
Are you taking the easy option, the convenient option,
Mm-hmm.
versus doing the work of doing some mindful masturbation or just, taking some time to fantasize, just with your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Being a lot more aware of what you want from your sex life, and asking yourself, like, realistically, is porn helping you get there?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think just being quite mindful around how much you're consuming it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think a common thing I also suggest is like having a bit of a habit tracker on your app, being like, because I think once you start paying attention to how much you're using it or how much you're relying on it, it can be confronting. But I think that's like with most habits that we bring attention to. you realize how much you use it as a crutch. And you just kind of put blockers as much as you can towards that.
So what kind of porn sites, ethical porn sites, do you think deserve our attention?
My go-to is always Belissa.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I always blank on this one. So I might need to get back to you on that one, actually.
I have one thing I do like about Belessa or Belisa or whatever is that they have couples on there. So you can like follow a couple or subscribe to a couple, and it's just a little more relatable. And honestly, like I have found it more arousing to like that there's so much intentionality there, and then there's like added real life chemistry and a real life dynamic and real life care, that it's not just an activity, it's so much more than that. So I do enjoy that about that app. I mean, that, I guess, website. And then I know that there's a free option and a paid option, which is chill. What about OnlyFans? What do you think about OnlyFans?
I do rate it in the sense of course, often it's vulva owners kind of like taking control of their bodies and ownership and kind of, creating an avenue for money, really. And I think that's wonderful in that respect. But in terms of creating as a space for ethical porn, I think there is limitations in the respect that, I think as in the respect of any streaming site, that there are kind of implications when you post things, or rules about how you can post things. Like just with what's it called, the Pornhub, you can kind of, there's space for it to be downloaded or stolen or something like that.
Right. And I think another thing that just popped into my head is just to make it super clear that like no one here is villainizing porn stars. Like just porn stars are actors. Like they are doing their job. They are getting paid to do a job, and that is to act out a sex scene. And it's just like how, for some reason, the first person that came into my head was Chris Pratt is paid to be in Marvel movies. It's the same way that porn stars are paid to be in porn. So it's a job, and it's a legitimate job, but they're literally doing a job. They're not like, just like movies don't enact real life experiences, porn doesn't really either. So that I wanted to put that in there because I know we're both sex positive and pro sex work, and that it's legitimate just because porn, just like, sometimes on that note, movies are damaging to our psyche as well because they give us unrealistic expectations of romance and relationships.
Yes.
So it's literally the same thing. And the amount of unpacking that so many of us don't even realize we have to do about that in relationship dynamics is, I think, very related to the consumption of pornography in some ways.
Yeah, I think we are starting to get a lot more conscious around it as well. Even things like social media, and the impact of posting like, photoshopped images versus, real images. And I think we're all starting to become a lot more aware of the impacts it has on our mental health, but also like self-esteem and the way that we feel about ourselves. And I think, like porn is one aspect of that coming into it as well. But we are starting to get a lot more critical of how we consume media or the news, or being a lot more conscious of the other impacts or other factors that come into that message being created.
Right. And with that awareness comes like a lot of empathy for everyone who's experiencing insecurities or difficulties around this consumption of like basically sensationalism, and then having it reflect on your day-to-day or your face or your body or your relationship expectations. And it's just something everyone can relate to on some level or another.
Yeah, and I think the porn aspect is one that is very, very slowly making its way through, I think. And I think that's just attached to the taboo nature of like, just talking about sex in general still. That still exists in our culture. But it is really inspiring and empowering to see it become more of a common knowledge, or like, you know, more general conversation. Thinking about like, okay, this thing isn't having a good impact on many people.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about it? What steps can we do to change it for the better?
And it's important to remember that, because I think when you're in a bubble of people who care, you forget that there's other people who just cannot relate and think that nothing's being done.
Yeah.
So noted. Final question for you. As a sexologist, sex therapist, what is one of your biggest lessons or realizations to date? It could be like very simple, nothing fancy. I like to like just leave with some wisdom.
I think the biggest lesson I've been really leaning into lately, especially, I think it comes up almost all the time in the therapy room, and I think that's creating space for pleasure can actually be really difficult. And it can feel incredibly inaccessible in the society we live in that rewards busyness and rewards productivity. So while pleasure fuels us, it gives us life and energy and motivation, it's not necessarily productive by social definitions, so it doesn't make us money, it doesn't gain us social status. It's not a fundamental need like eating, sleeping. So people can go their entire lives never having an orgasm or never thinking about what turns them on or off. And in theory, it wouldn't really be an issue, so pleasure has to be a conscious choice. And it can be really difficult to give ourselves permission to choose it. But with everything happening in the world right now, everything feeling like an absolute shit show, I think that's when it's more important than ever to kind of lean into pleasure and to find joy in the little things, like watching the sunset or having a solo dance party or taking the scenic drive home.
Yeah.
And it's formed a big part of my work, asking people, if you chose pleasure today, what would it look like? How would your life be different? That's my favorite question.
Yeah. And on that note, like just noticing that pleasure it's not exclusively sexual. Like what little way can you choose pleasure today? Literally could be going outside and looking at the moon or reading a book. Like it could be so small, and it's all of those things also impact your sexual health. So they work in tandem, and it's true. Pleasure isn't always what you expect it to be. So what little ways can you make it easy for yourself?
And building your capacity to access pleasure outside of sex makes it so much easier to access it inside of sex.
Yes, it's so true. And when you're functioning on a frequency of like, I've given myself a lot of pleasure in this day, this week, this month, that you're so much more in tune with yourself and your body, that allows you to interact sexually in a more intentional and like magnificent, for lack of a better term, way.
Exactly. It just gives you so much more energy and space to do so, because you are familiar with what you enjoy or what makes you feel good. So you naturally get more curious about what makes you feel good in the sexual sense, and a bit more explorative or curious about things.
Yeah. And being in this industry, I think once I started entering it, I realized there's all these like pleasure pioneers or like pleasure activists. And I don't think I fully understood what that meant, because I was like, what are they trying to, what does it really mean? And it means exactly like what you just said. And I think that's why there's so many people involved in this, because it's so important to livelihood, even though it's not as necessary as eating and drinking and sleeping. It's just helps all the other parts.
It makes the world go round.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was so lovely to connect more deeply and like have an intentional conversation and hear all your wisdom, because clearly you're very full of it, and I am excited to talk about more things in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it so much. I've loved meeting you and chatting with you as well. It's been really great.